Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and for Chapter 6 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography, I'd like to show you how to set up your camera for taking pictures with studio lights. Now, one of the most common questions in the readers group when somebody gets studio lights is why their picture is overexposed. And what happens is people put their camera in automatic mode and then they take a picture. Works with your flash, right? Doesn't work with studio light. So I'll just put my camera in automatic mode and take a picture and we'll show you what happens. As you can see, she's wildly overexposed and pretty blurry, and the camera picked a shutter speed of 1/3 of a second, which you don't need when you're in a studio, right? Because we have plenty of lights. We can pick whatever shutter speed we want. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put our camera into manual mode. Now I'm going to pick ISO 100. That's easy. That's one setting you just don't have to worry about. So right over to ISO 100. Now we have to deal with the shutter speed and the aperture. And these don't behave anything like they do when you're dealing with just regular ambient natural light, or even when you're dealing with an on-camera flash. They're totally different things. Your shutter speed will not change your exposure whatsoever. You can pick a shutter speed of 1/8 of a second or 1/100th of a second, and your exposure is going to be about the same. And that's because you're getting most of your light from your strobes. You might allow a little more ambient light in, but it's not going to change the amount of light that your flashes put out, right? So what we need to do is to pick the fastest shutter speed we can that still allows our camera to sync with our flashes. And that's not the same for every camera, and it's not the same for every set of studio lights, because your camera has to send a signal to the studio lights to say, hey, flash now. And sometimes that signal takes a little longer and the flashes aren't quite on top of it. The different types of shutter mechanisms built into different cameras vary too. So your camera has what's called an X sync speed. And sometimes this is 1/80th of a second, sometimes it's 1/250th of a second. Sometimes on nice cameras with leaf shutters, it'll be more like 1/500th of a second or even faster. But most of us with DSLRs, the sync speed's right around like 1/80th or 1/250th of a second. Usually I just resort to a little trial and error and find a shutter speed that works perfectly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out a little fast. I'm going to set my shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, take a test shot, and then work down until I find one that works. So Chelsea's half in shadow. Obviously that's not working right, and that's happening because my camera shutter is moving across the focal plane. It's not open completely when the strobes are firing. So they're firing when the shutter has partially covered the frame. And that black part of the frame is the part that was covered up by the shutter when the strobes fired. So the way you fix that is by using a slower shutter speed. So that was at 1/500th. I'll crank that down to 1/250th and try again. That's almost right, but you can still see a little black border along the right edge there. Now that should have worked because this camera has a sync speed of 1/250th of a second, and these lights should be able to sync with it. But that's why I say a little trial and error doesn't hurt. It didn't work perfectly. So I'm just going to go one notch down from 1/250th of a second and try again. That puts me at 1/80th of a second. Great, so at 1/80th of a second, the entire frame is covered in light. Now, don't try to adjust the shutter if your picture is too bright or too dark. Again, the shutter's not going to impact the amount of light coming out of these strobes. You just want to make sure the entire frame is covered in light. So the last step is to adjust your aperture. Now, your aperture is the only thing that's going to control how dark or how light your picture is. So you could use a light meter, and I'll show you how to do that in a second, but I really just prefer a little trial and error because it doesn't require you to leave your camera and it happens pretty quickly. So I'll start out at f4 and I'll keep raising that aperture until I'm happy with the exposure. That's a little bright, so I'll raise that f-stop up to f5.6 and try again. Her face is still a little blown out, so I'm going to raise it one more stop to f8. That looks perfect. So the settings I ended up with are ISO 100, always ISO 100, that one's easy. Shutter speed of 1/80th of a second. If I come back to the studio later and I've moved the lights all around, I'll still use 1/80th of a second. I know that's the sync speed that works with this camera body, and this set of lights. The aperture might change depending on how I have the light set up, but f8 gave me a good exposure here. In the future, if the lights are brighter or closer or farther or whatever, that could change. So every time you bring a different model in, or if you move your lights around, you're gonna have to find your aperture again. I'll say with monolights like these, you can also adjust the light output up or down. I usually start with the lights at about 1/4 power. And then if I want them brighter, I have the ability to move them up or move them down a little bit. Now I promised you I would also show you how to use a light meter. A light meter detects how much light is coming from the strobes and tells you what your settings should be. Now you need a flash meter specifically because some lower end light meters won't detect how much flash goes off, and you need a way to trigger the meter. So this particular setup, this is the PulseBuff Cyber Commander. It also triggers the lights and it has a little light meter built in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to where my model is standing and face this meter here out and then trigger the lights with a button on the front. Close your eyes. So my light meter just tells me what f-stop number I need to put my camera at. Of course I have to tell it what ISO I'm shooting at, but it confirmed that f8 was right about a good exposure.